Hello everyone, Andrew Martin here, and welcome to the weekly Guildford Junior Chess Club summary video, where I go over what I covered the night before to a group of improving youngsters. And this week I decided to concentrate on endgames you must know. I started with some very basic examples and then went on to other more advanced examples, as we're going to see as we go through the video. And the first position is perhaps the most basic of all, the checkmate with queen against king. Now, of course, anybody beyond beginner level should know how to do this endgame. But it's interesting because when you get this endgame, in an actual over-the-board game, you're probably going to be very short of time. So you've got to be extremely accurate as to the way you finish black off in this position. It's no good playing 20 moves, lots of checks. The game goes on. You might lose on time and blow a winning position. So the first challenge I set to the group last night was to checkmate for white in less than 12 moves. That gives white the scope to make a single mistake or maybe two mistakes, because it's possible to do it in 10 moves or less, as we're going to see. And it's quite interesting. There were some quite strong players in the group, and a lot of them failed to do it in 12 moves or less. So there was some point to this basic exercise. Okay, well, without further ado, let me show you the best way to do it. And the first rule of thumb is that you bring your king towards his king whenever you can. And the logic behind this is that the queen is so strong, she's all powerful, she can look after herself. The king wanders around the board pathetically one square at a time. And as this is a battle of two pieces versus one, it's important to use the king as aggressively as possible. So black can do nothing and will let him stick around in the middle. White can bring the king closer. Black moves, tries to stay in the middle for as long as possible, and white can still bring the king up. So that's what white does. King d6. Right, so we've had three moves, and now suddenly it's not possible to bring the white king closer anymore. So you've got to make a queen move. Now, a lot of beginners give checks in a position like this, which may or may not be okay, but I think the move that's easiest to understand is queen a5, because it simply restricts the black king. Well, let's give black a move here, and then white closes in with his queen. Now we can bring our king closer, in we come, and whatever black does now, there is no salvation whatsoever. Just to show you what might happen, if black goes king g7 here, we give a check. Well, let's say he goes back, we move in, we checkmate. Just dropping back to the position after king e5. Let's run that one more time. Check. What happens if he goes king h7? The king closes in. Checkmate again. And finally, king comes to e7. Well, now it's easy. We check. Close in with the king. Checkmate once more. And there's, well, numerous checkmates here. White can literally checkmate on any one of those three squares. So that's how it's done. And whatever your level, you should be able to do this in 10 moves or less. That's perfect technique. And that will save you a lot of points in the long run. You won't lose on time in a position like this, which could be most frustrating. Right, now there's a bit of toing and froing with this video because I've got a lot of puzzles lined up for you. And we move now to the second one, which is, again, a basic checkmate. But for young and improving players, this type of thing is a revelation to see how it's done and to be able to do it in your own games. Okay, this takes longer, it's more fiddly, but the basic principle is the same. We move our king towards his king whenever possible. And now we've got an uncommon situation after only one move here, where white can't move the king any closer. So what should white do? Again, it's interesting. I gave the group 25 moves to do this. Very generous indeed. And most of them managed it, but some didn't. Again, they were giving silly checks with the rook, which isn't really appropriate. So rook d1. And what does that do? It cuts the black king off in the same half as the white king and prevents the black king from entering into an entire half of the board. So black sticks around in the middle. We bring our king up. He makes a move. I mean, there's nothing really he can do. And now we just continue to ruthlessly cut down on the number of squares that the black king can go to. And really, it should be, as long as you follow that formula, fairly easy from here. This is the fiddly bit. The king can attack the enemy piece, the rook in this case, which of course you can't do with the queen. But well, let's just see how this is navigated. A little bit of toing and froing, but essentially there's absolutely nothing that black can do to stop this gradual reducing of the number of squares that he can go to. And now the king must go to the side. And of course, as soon as he goes to the side, he's toast. If he goes to h3, well, we can literally move our rook to a lot of squares here, but let's just see rook a2, because it's kind of like an optical illusion. Surely that can't be the move, but yes, it can, because that is checkmate. And if we go back, if he goes king g1, we just come in. A little bit of toing and froing here. Again, that strange looking move, but once again, it's based on checkmate. There we are. And finally, into the corner he goes. Now it's very easy. We move in, king g1, and then checkmate. I would urge all young players, especially improvers, to practice these checkmating skills constantly. Whatever you do, you have to know how to mate with the rook and the queen perfectly. Okay, so now let's move on. Right, a very important endgame. Again, very basic fare. But I didn't actually get the chance to go over this with the children last night, but I would like to have done. Yes, this position with white to move is actually a win. Now, let's see how it's done. I don't expect you to remember long move sequences. Really, that's not the way to learn how to play chess. What you've got to remember is concepts and ideas. And the first concept that we have to understand in this endgame is that white's trying to get his king in front of the pawn and push black back as a result. You're using your king actively and aggressively. And really now, whatever black does is going to be pushed back. So let's give black king to d6. White goes king to f5. We'll come back to this position in a minute to see what happens after king d5. But for the time being, let's have a look at king e7. King e5. We can close in without even touching our pawn. He goes back, we come forward. He goes to one side. And now once we've reached this position, we can start to push our pawn, because we've got the black king exactly where we want him. And now we force what we call a bypass maneuver. We clear out the square e7 to get the pawn rolling. Here we go, there we go, and that is the end. You know what to do because we learned how to mate with the queen earlier on. Going back, if black tries to create some hassle, he doesn't really create any hassle at all, because once again, we're reaching our winning position there. Remember that, keep that in your mind. That's what you're angling for in this endgame, and you should be able to win in comfort and the pawn queens. So what you've got to remember is simple. Keep the king, get the king in front of the pawn. Okay, so let's move on, and it's exactly the same position. But what I've done is I've changed the side to move. And importantly, in this position, if it's black to move, black can actually draw by using his king aggressively. This is an interesting case where white can, in fact, get his king in front of the pawn, but it doesn't do him any good. Because if he plays king, let's say king e3 here, we just play king e5, and he can't go any further. He needs to make a pawn move here to make progress. And whichever way white goes, black takes what we call the opposition, and white cannot make any progress. So if we go back to king d5, what can white try here? Well, he can try a pawn move. And now we've got a very instructive display of technique by black, showing how he draws this. He drops back into the centre. And when white comes up, black takes the opposition. The kings are in opposition. Very important. The only way white can make progress is to push his pawn, and then we go through the same routine, dropping back into the centre when we need to. And this is going to inexorably lead to stalemate. The same pattern is repeated, and now whichever way white goes, black's going to take the opposition. I mean, usually a strong player will fiddle about here and try and extract a mistake as a result. But as long as you drop back into the middle, you'll be absolutely fine. He's got to come to one side or the other in the end, and then you just follow him and stalemate. So backing up, we can say that if it's white to play, white wins this position. If it's black to play, black draws this position. Very important information. Time to move on. Well, now the exercise has got a bit more difficult, and once again, the kids were required to play out a king and pawn ending. This was a lesson in technique, a lesson in how to convert a pawn majority. It's 5 pawns each, but white has got a majority of 3 pawns to 2 on the king side, and black's majority of 3 pawns to 2 on the queen side isn't really going anywhere if white plays correctly. You can't create what we call a passed pawn from black's 3 pawn majority on the queen side, whereas white can create a passed pawn using his own pawns. And that brought us to the whole point of endgame technique. What are the players trying to achieve? They're trying to create a passed pawn. That is the absolute basis of endgame technique. When you get a passed pawn, you hope to tie the enemy down, gives you the freedom of the board, and generally what white's expecting to do here is to create a passed pawn, force the black king to stay on the king side, then the white king wanders into the queen side and gobbles up these 3 pawns here, and then white wins easily. So let's see how it's done. Well, in an endgame like this, the first thing to do is improve the position of your pieces to the maximum possible extent before pushing pawns. A lot of the kids started pushing the pawns straight away. There's nothing wrong with that if white plays accurately, but the best technique is just to bring the king up into a better position, which is exactly what white's done. This is good technique, and the black king is being confined. So black just has to make a move here. He can do nothing. I mean, black does best to wait and hope white makes a mistake. And now white pushes the right pawn. And in general, when you're trying to create a passed pawn from a majority, you push the pawn that's got nothing in front of it. That's the first one to push. So white pushes his f pawn, and black does nothing. Well, excuse me, wrong key. White comes up. And now, again, black is hopelessly placed here. He makes a move. Now, let's say he starts pushing the pawns on the queen side rather hopelessly. f5, king f6, king f4, h6, and now h4. You see, white cannot be stopped. Here we see him going through with the process of creating a passed pawn and then just blocking black off on the queen side. And there's absolutely nothing that black can do here. He's got to keep his king on the king side, as we can see, to stop the pawn. I mean, there could be a bit of toing and froing. Let's see the technique. And white gobbles up all the pawns and wins. So let's see how white does this in the main line, or what I've chosen as the main line. I mean, there are many ways to win, but as long as you are careful here, then you just can stop black from doing anything. Don't touch those pawns, block it all off, and now the passed pawn is created. Donk, 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 and white has got his passed pawn, which is going to win the game. So black drops back. Black takes the opposition in the last hope that white might make a mistake. The passed pawn marches on. King goes back. In he comes. Opposition. f7. King f8. King f6. And this is what we call Zugzwang. Black doesn't have any legal move which doesn't lose the game. Possibly his best is h6, hoping that white will have a heart attack. h5, and that's curtains, because black's got to play b6. White takes it. Black's only legal move is a5, and now we just win by queening the pawn on the next turn, and that will be checkmate. So using a simple example like this, we teach technique to a younger group, and even a group of adult beginners will learn a lot from an example like this. As long as you get them to play it out first. Don't show them the right technique right away. Just let them play it out first and experience what it's like to play a king and pawn ending in their own games. Right, let us move on. Okay. Well, now I did manage to show them the Philidor and Lucina positions, which are two of the most important Rook End Games. Rook End Games are very common because, well, the rooks are walled up in the corner at the start of the game. That generally makes them the last pieces to be exchanged, other things being equal. And rook and pawn endings are therefore common. So we come to a position which is known as the Philidor Technique, and I'm going to show you what it is. Black can draw this position as long as he's accurate. And let's see how it's done. So white tries to win by advancing his pawn. Black can get into a mess if he doesn't know what he's doing. But the most important thing that you need to do now is to cut the white king off, to force the white pawn forward, to create a shield for the white king. And now you cut him off again. The idea is that actually you might come to a king and pawn ending where white can't get his king in front of the pawn. The further he pushes it, the less chance there is of getting his king in front of the pawn. And you draw by merely exchanging rooks. I'm going to show you what that means in a minute. But let's continue with black playing the next key move, rook g6, cutting the white king out of the game. In order to get into the game, the pawn's got to come forward. And now the next accurate move, rook g1. The idea of which is to give checks from behind. So, for instance, if white comes in with his king, threatening checkmate, we go rook d1 check, and he can't escape the checks. Just as an aside, if white had played rook a4 here, the idea of which is to, black can play king e7 here and draw. But let's say black goes check, just as an example, white blocks. The easiest way, using our earlier knowledge of king and pawn versus king, is just to trade the rooks off here. Bring the king up, and then we reach our drawn position, which we examined earlier. So that was the Philidor technique. Some knew it, some didn't in the group. They all know it now. Moving on, we come now to the famous Lucina technique, Lucina position. Well, white's pawn is getting ready to queen. The only problem is his king's in the way. So white's task really is to get the king out. But at the moment, the black rook is stopping it. Well, this was an interesting one. Again, several members of the group knew what to do, which was very impressive from my point of view. But nevertheless, it's a really good idea to run over basic endgames such as this with children. So the best first move really has to be check. Sets a little trap. If black mistakenly plays king d6, we just go king d8. And we can queen our pawn on the next turn, which wins. Then we come to the rook versus king endgame, again, mentioned earlier. So black has to move his king. So in principle, white has now played an excellent move because he's driven the black king further away from his king and pawn, making it easier for the king to come out. And now there are two ways to win. I was most impressed when one of the young players showed me rook c4. She obviously knew that this was the right move. And this is known as building a bridge. White's going to bring his king out, and at the right moment, put the rook in the way from black checks, enabling the pawn to queen. Let's see how it's done. Incidentally, you might like to consider why rook c5 is not best. Well, I think black can play king b6. Okay, white can just go into reverse and play the same idea. But nevertheless, that's not as accurate as rook c4. Well, what can black do? Nothing. Got to pass, and now out comes the king. Black starts to give checks. That's what they do. Another check. King e5 check, and now the point of rook c4. White puts the rook in the way. Very nice. Just going back. Just run that one more time to see it. What happens if black just passes in this position? Well, now we go rook c5 with the idea of rook e5. And once again, white queens the pawn. In actual fact, if we run back to the start with white giving that check, king to b7, I've always found that bringing the rook to f8 is an easy to understand plan. If you don't know the bridge building technique, then you can win by just bringing the rook around to f8. Let's see it. Down he comes. And the thing about this is that it's an easy way to get the pawn through, because what can black play in this position? He has to move his rook. Now the king comes out, and that is that is curtains for poor black. He can check, but then the king comes all the way up the board. Thank you very much. And in the end, the pawn can't be stopped from queening. Well, it can, but black has to give up his rook. So those endgames, the Philidor and the Lucina positions, are very important, and you're going to have them in your games for sure as you get stronger. So it's worthwhile running over these examples once or twice till you get them firmly fixed in your head. You should know these techniques. Which brings me to my final position. And if there are any adults out there in the audience still awake, this is a far more difficult position than any one I've showed to you so far. It's kind of a bonus position. It's a study, and it's white to move. What should the result of the game be? Now, whether you're an improver, a beginner, or experienced adult player, or whatever, perhaps it's worth just thinking over this position for a few minutes, because it does show the beauty and the complexity of chess. White to play, what should the result be? Okay, well, this is a very nice study indeed. White's got some threats, mainly concerned with advancing this pawn. The black bishop seems a little bit offside. And if white plays d6 here, he puts black to the test. Again, the bishop's a long way from home, so black can't go gobbling pawns in a position like this because white will win after d takes e7. So after this move, d6, black's got to take it. And now white pushes his pawn. And a lot of players would just throw out their hands in a position like this and say, oh my goodness, I can't stop the pawn. But black has got a very clever device up his sleeve. He sacrifices his pawn on d6. And now he's going to get his bishop back to cover the advance of the pawn. For instance, if king takes d5, well, black can choose here. He can move his pawn up to d3. That must win. And then he just puts his bishop on g1. And that's the end of the game. So after d5 check, white's got to come back. Now black thinks he's being very clever, because after a6, he can go bishop b8 and stop the pawn. But white is equally clever, as he sacrifices his pawn here. And after bishop takes a7, which has to be played, that is a beautiful stalemate. A rather unusual and extraordinary finish to the game. Well, again, I didn't get the chance to show this to the kids last night. I'm quite a strong fan of showing studies and things like that to children, because it exposes them to the depth and the originality of the game. You have to think outside the box to get positions like this right. And so I hope you enjoyed that study. Okay, onward. Next week, we move to session 4. Thank you for viewing.